specialist for a number of years. I grew up on the north side of the Miami-Howard County Line Road, so therefore I ended up at Northwestern. Had I been on the south, I was on the south side. Had I been on the north side, I'd have gone to Mechanical. Anyway, I was well on my way to being a veterinarian. When I was a kid, I wanted to be St. Francis, and that seemed like the thing to do, take care of the animals, take care of the world. But my family had a lot of foster children. We had about 150 kids come through our home, and my mom started saying to me, I always love telling moms this, that it does sink in what you've been saying to us. My mom started saying, have you ever thought about being a pediatrician? You seem to have a gift with kids. And it took me, like most doctors, I have a bachelor's in agriculture, and then withdrew from the vet school to go to medical school. But one of my great fears was this. And I said there were 3 reasons I didn't want to be a doctor, but the primary concern was, how would I survive children dying? And then for the next 30 years of my life was committed to my great spiritual leaders, these children. And they made real for me so much of my faith, what I prayed for, what I read, what I studied. And while I was training, I was the professor of medicine for pediatric rehab, and I had this individual, Dr. Joe Bergeron. He had been a missionary building churches in India, and he said, do you know anyone who would help me set up some clinics in India? And I said, yeah, I would. And so got involved in India, and he and I were always fascinated about the story of the Shroud of Turin, the burial cloth of Jesus. And in fact, in about 1985, there was an article that came out, Journal of American Medical Association, and the title was, On the Physical Death of Jesus. So Joe wrote a similar article probably 7 or 8 years ago now, maybe even longer than that. And I always teased him. I went to Catholic grade school, and I said, your grammar and spelling are just not that good. And so when the article was passed on to be published, it was turned down by all these different journals. And in fact, one of the editorial board members even made the comment, why would we want to publish something on a mythological figure? And Joe said that thankfully one of the board members contacted him and said, I think it's a very interesting topic, and I think you should check with the Journal on Legal and Forensic Medicine. So with that, he submits it. They said to him, you need to have someone proofread it and clean it up. And it came to me, and I fixed it up, and we got it published. And then I said to Joe, I have always wanted to do more research on this myself. I wanted to make it more real for people, particularly for our young people. In this day and age, you better have a really good PowerPoint or a website or, some kind of computer game, right, to catch their attention. But what I'm going to share with you today, I think you'll find fascinating. It's historical. And in the process of trying to track down all this information, Joe and I have made a lot of friends. He actually published a book and then a second book. First book is The Crucifixion of Jesus Christ, a medical doctor's perspective. Then he wrote a book, he wrote the foreword to a book on the story of Betty Baxter. Did we get copies of that to you? Okay, good. Because the miracles are all around us. It's just we become so, I think, cynical, but we're also so distracted. I do a lot of medical mission work throughout the world. I've worked in about 27 countries, and one thing I said about Haiti was, you found that when you get away from all of the static here, you can so clearly tune in to your prayer, your mindfulness, and listen. So, is this? There we go.
Sounds better. Thank you.
And let me get that. There you go.
Thank you.
And I told Daryl, I said, well, at least we'll find a church that's at least interested. And I'd be happy to give any of this to a church that needs it. And I walked in and I was like, it belongs here. The pews, it's just, I love your church. And the thing that caught my attention was when I went to the website and I saw followers of Jesus meeting in a cornfield, I thought, that's for me. Should be simple, very simple. So what I want to do today is try to make this as clear as I can. And I, being a pediatric rehab doctor, you imagine I take care of kids, horrible, horrible things have happened to them. And I always told the parents, I said, look, we often speak in Latin, so you think we're smarter than we are. But in plain, simple English, I need you to know what's happened and how do we best take care of your child. So today I'm going to throw out some terms, but I'm going to make sure I break those down. And then we'll make it clear what this actually means. Okay, so CSI Jerusalem. You can't help it. You got to hook people. This crucifixion scene investigation, Jerusalem. Next slide. Now, this is going to be a medical discussion of the passion of Jesus Christ. I should preface this by saying not only did Joe Bergeron do a lot of this research and put this book together, and you should take a look at that, but also Barry Schwartz. B-A-R-R-I-E, Schwartz is S-C-H-W-O-R-T-Z. If you go online, he is the documenting photographer from all the research in the 1978 STIRP team who did the scientific analysis. And he's an absolute believer. I mean, we have no doubt this is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, and as I tell people, you do with that what you want, but I think when you start putting together the facts that are in the New Testament, supported by the prophecy in the Old Testament, this is what you have. Next slide. So, the Passion of Jesus. The prayer in Gethsemane begins 9 p.m. to midnight. He goes to the house of Annas, this was by 1 a.m. Now remember, these are the Jewish leaders. These are the priests, and it's very familial. And Caiaphas and Annas were both related. One was the son-in-law of the other, and so you got to keep the power. So you can imagine how difficult Jesus was causing some real problems, right? So he goes to Caiaphas from 2 to 5 a.m. where he's tried and beaten, goes to Pontius Pilate, because now you want to get someone else to say, yeah, let's kill him. He needs to be crucified. Goes to Herod. You can see everyone's trying to pass the buck. He gets returned to Pilate, where he's caned and beaten by a company of soldiers, whatever that means, how many individuals. Scourged prior to execution, delivered to crucifixion, and he was on the cross from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Now, here's an important thing you need to know. The Romans crucified a lot of people. A lot of people. They were very good at killing people. Crucifixion was great because it was like putting a billboard along the road. And you see some images where, if you look at some of the a lot of the movies that were done in the 50s and 60s, when they actually did do movies about the Bible, the cross was often very high, and it looked like they almost put them up on a telephone pole. Probably not. Probably you were probably carrying the cross beam of the cross, not the entire cross, and they would have a notch, lock it in place, and truth be told, this is very personal. Your loved ones who are here are probably no more than a couple feet from your face when you're going through this excruciating torture. So Jesus lasts, according to the Bible, only about 6 hours on the cross. Some people lasted for days, just so you know. Now, I want you to think for a moment about that cross, and we'll go into the types of cross, but you have the vertical piece and you have the horizontal piece. Horizontal piece was called the Petibulum, the vertical piece is called the stipes, and you have so many soldiers who are going to make this happen. And again, they're very good at killing people. And yes, like we have now, documentation. This individual is dead. So how can you quickly put someone up, crucify them, see to their death? They're removed. Many of them, if there was no one else to be crucified that day, they might leave them there and allow the birds of prey to feed on them. Or they just throw the bodies out in a heap and allow the animals to devour them. So there are a lot of interesting coincidences, and I always love to say, coincidence is when God winks. There's a lot of that going on, not only with how this happened, how the body was retained, and even how the Jewish burial was done at that time to give us this history. Next slide. And of course, in Gethsemane, we know that Jesus is fervently praying, and he's saying to the apostles, stay up, be alert, be with me. Now, I have to be honest with you. As a kid, our church would reenact the Passion, and as the congregates in the church, we were supposed to say, crucify him, crucify him. I couldn't bring myself to do that. I also remember thinking, hey, if Jesus told me to stay awake, I would have stayed awake, right? And you also think, and Peter denying Jesus 3 times at a most critical time, I'd like to think I'd do better than that. The good news is we fail quite often, don't we? But it's nice to know that Jesus picked failures to be his disciples and then his apostles. Thank goodness. So, next slide. Now, this is the first thing that caught my attention. And I said, I've traveled around the world, all these different countries, and it's interesting to hear the Bible story in Tamil Nadu, in India, hear what the Haitians say when it's written in Creole, how even our own Bibles, right? Which version, which one are you reading? But here's what's interesting. Luke 22:44, and Luke was a doctor. Luke says, being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. Now, what's interesting is this, and even as a doctor, I still was thinking, when I read this or talked to Christians in different areas, even in China, I'm always impressed with my friends in China who are defiant enough to say, this is my faith, and I will stand up to the government. Hematodrosis, believe it or not, it happens. It does happen. I remember thinking, they just say, well, he was so profusely sweating, it was like, and some of the Bible translations I read sounded more like that. He always just profusely sweating, as if he'd been cut and was just, bleeding out. No, it goes from pink to red. You actually can bleed into your sweat. And as you see here, Hulebeck reviewed 76 reported cases, 44 cases that involve systemic illness, and it's tied to different things. Most important to us at this point, though, is psychogenic. 32 cases with 9 single episodes. So as doctors, as research people, the science of medicine, and by the way, I always tell people I'm so left brain and so right brain, it's like a curse and a blessing, right? But I love to research this stuff, and you come out going, all of these scientists who have this haughty opinion that, somehow science negates our faith, not at all. In fact, I find it coming full circle right now. In fact, I read an article a while back that said, scientists for years have been doing all these studies. As they climb the mountain of knowledge, they are discovering the theologians. Anyway, so if you look, 32 cases, 9 single episodes, because this is the only time we were told Jesus sweated blood, right? Okay, so we're interested in that. Single episode cases were fear-mediated, impending execution. Seven cases were that, fear of death by shipwreck, and 1 fear of rape. What we do know is they can become more edematous, where the fluid leaks in under the skin, but the skin becomes hypersensitive, so it's painful. It's painful to have this too, okay? And so what happens is the blood vessels, and they've actually been able to get small cuts to take a look, a little biopsy, to see how those blood vessels can rupture into the sweat glands. So let's go to the next one. This is a young lady, teenager. I believe she's from India, but she gets very pronounced hematodrosis on occasion. Now, it's interesting because they treat this with an anxiolytic. Lorazepam was the word that they had up there, which is a medication to cut down on the anxiety and fear, like how your fight or flight system kicks in, the sympathetic nervous system can lead to this. Next. And of course, Judas. Judas kisses Jesus. It's always fascinating to me when we look at all the idioms that we have in our language, how many of them go back to the Bible. Isn't it amazing? I mean, I just, salt of the earth. And we say that I say that a lot. And it's just, but again, you'll hear somebody be called a Judas, right? So there's Judas kissing Jesus to let them know, here he is. Next slide. Now, here's one of the things. Have any of you had the opportunity to go to the Holy Land yet? I'm going to tell you, here's the thing that struck me, because I always joke, like, when I'm going to, I used to tell people, they go, now, do you tell your mom everywhere you're going? And my mom's passed, and she was pretty darn intuitive, and I know she really keeps eyes on me now. But I remember I said, typically I'll call her after I've returned and say, hey, got back safely. But one time I was going into a war zone, and I said, and I don't like that, just so you know, I said, when hatred is palpable, it's just not a good feeling. And that time I called my mom, and she said, I've never said this, I wish you wouldn't do it. It was the only time she challenged me on that. I said, go to the monastery. They've known me before I was born. You went there when you were pregnant. Just tell them to pray for me, and I'm sure I'll be fine. And she went over to the monastery of the Poor Clares, and this was Sister Bernadette, who was a spry 86 to 90 at the time, I think. And she said, she tells Sister Bernadette, Chuck's going to go work with the Kosovar refugees. And this is where she's supposed to come through for me, right? And she says, poor Dr. Chuck, his heart is bigger than his brain. And I later told her, I said, Sister Bernadette, that wasn't the support I was looking for. Anyway. But here's what I love to tell my mom. I go, Mom, look, that map you saw of Kenya, or that map, it's a lot bigger than just 4 inches. So I'm sure I can find refuge somewhere. One of the great things about going to the Holy Land was seeing how all of this is walkable, traceable. People walked 26 miles in a day back then. We wouldn't dream of it now, but when you look at the area where the way the New Testament describes Jesus walking from one part to the next, where he goes to Caiaphas, Herod, he's going. This whole area, at that time, Jerusalem was probably no bigger than Kirkland, Indiana. 700. It was a metropolitan city, but it was not that large. So the whole area that he's walking is no more than probably a half a mile. And so this is where he is led before these individuals, and he's treated so poorly. But I think that was one of the things I appreciate about going there, seeing how close Bethlehem is to Jerusalem, and it's a powerful thing, I have to tell you, to be there and just think, he may have stepped here, he may have stepped here. Next. And now here's another interesting, remember we talked about it, I'm going to wash my hands of this. Right? Another great biblical reference that most people, I think a lot of people these days wouldn't understand where that comes from. But Pilate says, I'm washing my hands of this. You know what's interesting? That was not a Roman approach to anything. What it was, let's go to the next slide. No, let's back up. Just so you know, during this time, the Jews had an understanding that if there was a body found dead on their property, they would come there and wash their hands over the body and claimed to be free, that they did not have anything to do with this individual's passing. Okay? So it's actually Pontius Pilate being smart enough to say to the Jews, look, hey, I'm washing my hands. I have nothing to do with the potential death of this individual. That may be. Next slide. So Roman crucifixion. Let's talk about that, and then we'll get back to some of the scripture. Next slide. So Roman crucifixion, as I said, they were very good at this. They were very good at killing people, whether on the battlefields or in the way they tortured and killed people within the cities. But this began clear back in the 6th century BC, and then the Roman Empire picked it up 300 BC to 341 AD. Now, part of what I was thinking, like, if we're going to be talking about this, I don't know about you, but I love archaeology, and I often joke that I said, like most teenagers, I subscribe to the Biblical Archaeology Review Journal. Do you guys, you have subscriptions to that? Trust me, most of us didn't subscribe back then either. But one of the things that I wanted to make real was, what does a Roman spearhead look like? What is the Roman spearhead from that time frame? What is the Roman nail? What about the dice when they were casting lots to get his clothing? That's what this is. So this is a 1st century Roman spearhead, 1st century Roman nail, and a die. Now, I had a medical student working with me, and so I told him, I said, look, we're going to do a little bit of history, and I need you to track these things down for me. So he goes online, he's looking for them, he comes back to me, and he says, are you aware of how expensive this stuff is? I said, well, when it comes to Jesus, I try not to skimp. So this is the real deal. This is within the AD 100, so this would have been the time frame. I don't know if you'd seen it before, but so let's talk about how is Roman crucifixion done. Execution, it involves 5 Roman people. The centurions, you would have a quaterno, so 4 soldiers who actually were directed by the exactor mortis, and they efficiently kill people. And you can see how they might want to drag it out, make more of a point. Depends on how many people they're killing off. But belief is, these were hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million people who had been crucified by the Romans. When they made reference to the person being crucified, they were called the crucarius. So that's the masculine ending, and reference to crux, which is the cross. And so the individual who is going to be murdered by this route is going to be called the crucarius. And as I mentioned, the Petibulum was carried to the execution site. This says 70 pounds, just so you know, depending on the type of wood. This is where Mel comes in. I got to tell you, I actually had someone cut a cedar Petibulum for me. And we were saying, how big, 6 by 6, 5 by 5, you're trying to get an estimate. And every time I carried it in for a lecture, because I thought, hey, that might be something interesting, people want to feel imagine being healthy and carrying this, but after you've been dehydrated, beaten, and now you're expected to carry this to the site. I asked him to do a 5-foot one for me instead of a 6-foot. You know why? Just practical. Fits in the car easier. But they were typically about 5 or 6 feet long. And notice that's the important thing. We've already talked about that next bullet point. This happened in a very conspicuous place just outside the city. You wanted people to see this because the Romans were occupying the country. They wanted to make sure nobody else pulled these stunts. Okay? And then we're going to go to the next slide where we're going to talk about the types of crosses. Okay, so the crus simplex, as you can see here, is just a pike. This was actually used, the Nazis, the way they treated the Jews a lot, would use a simple spike, a simple stake. The next one you see where the Petibulum is a cross beam. But stop and think just about, practically speaking, How do you support the body weight? Can you lock it in place? That's where we say the crux commissa is probably the tau cross, is probably the one used most often, and perhaps this is what Jesus was crucified on. But again, if you think, the exector mortis is directing this. We've got 4 people. They've nailed the hands onto the cross, and yes, they may or may not use rope also, and then they lock it into place. So if you're lifting up and locking into place, the individual being crucified, as you can see, Mary might have been face to face with her son. You imagine that? I mean, probably no more than 18 inches, okay? And then, of course, the other one, St. Andrew's Cross, which is not, just again, I want you to see that this was something, it was a science to the Romans. They were very good at killing and torturing people. Next slide. Now, Flavius Josephus. Here's what's interesting. Barry Schwartz and I, we've sat and talked about this quite a bit. If this were Caesar or any other historical figure, the existence of this shroud would be talked about. You'd see it in the media almost daily. It's so incredible. But it's Jesus. So, which means you got to bury it or you got to live differently, right? So Flavius Josephus says they first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died and were crucified before the wall of the city. What he was saying, they were extremely brutal towards the Jews. The soldiers, out of wrath and hatred they bore the Jews, as you can see here, nailed them to different crosses, different postures, and you can imagine how much they would be hurling insults, spitting, kicking, all this other stuff. What's interesting is the incredible detail in the New Testament and the fact that Flavius Josephus had written extensively about Jesus and the Jews of that time. And again, if this were Caesar or someone else, well, there we go. I love that. That's good. Yeah. So let's go to the next slide. There it goes. Oh, and back in. Went out and came back in. We could try a Jim Nash. One of our friends was praying and meditating. His father was in a very bad way, and he was living out in Pittsburgh. Thought he should return to Indiana, and so he was praying. And he said, suddenly this cardinal landed near him, and he thought, oh, "What the heck?" He put out his finger and he started whistling, and it came and landed on his hand. And he somehow he said, "I had to shoot video because I knew everybody thought I was crazy." And then he happens to have some cats, and he introduced the bird to the cats, and they all. We still have our bird or not? Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So this is probably, how many of you saw The Passion of the Christ? Yeah. It's in that movie, they were using what's called a cat of nine tails, where it just grabs on and rips off the flesh. And that was used on occasion, but that was typically used if you were going to scourge the individual to death, okay? What we think when we look at what's on the shroud here, now we're going to make some reference here, probably something more like this. This is called a flagellum, and I would assume that the leather back then was a little bit wider and probably not quite so flimsy, but it typically had lead and glass, but it would not necessarily have the hooks and the claws to be ripping off the flesh. So I'll let you pass that around too. But I want you to take a close look. This is a full-size, high-definition replica of the shroud. And these are high-resolution photographs of the shroud, front and back. But you can see Jesus was actually whipped, literally, from the chest, shoulders, all the way down, even over the calves, you can see where these dumbbell-shaped lead pieces were hitting all over here. And you can see it on the front of the body too. Now, here's what's interesting. This thing has survived 2 fires now, and you still have a pretty incredible image. People often say, well, what is the white stuff? What are these triangles? These triangles here are where the cloth was sewn in by some nuns to try to repair it and keep it together. And there's a little bit of watermarks here and there. The creases, and there are some areas that were sort of touched by the flame, but again, did not burn. So you do have some scorch marks. And most fascinating was this. Barry said, they called me. He was the medical illustration photographer out at the Jewish hospital in Los Angeles at the time. And he said, what do you want me for? I'm a Jew. And he said, hey, look, there were, I don't know how many were on the team, but about an equal number of atheists, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, but the point was they were all scientists. And Barry said, he goes, I don't have a horse in this race. He still says that now when he's giving his talk. I don't have a horse in this race. Why would I say it's true if it's not? Ends up, he goes out there, and he said, look, I'll go along. They said, we just want you to do your usual good work and shoot the photos, and we'll find out what this is. Everybody presumed to this point that it was a painting. And they were looking back, when was this first evident? It goes clear back to Odessa and some other places where it was believed just to be a face on a cloth, and it was believed to have some miraculous healing properties. Again, it's debatable, right? It was not like we can interview those patients or something. But what was fascinating, they come to find out that this had a much longer history. In fact, it had been folded. There's crease marks, and they used to have it in an ancient church. Preparing for the service, it's believed they would pull this up so the face comes up and then the whole frontal image. That'd be pretty powerful in the church, wouldn't it, to see that? It's hard to see it on this now. Unfortunately, they've even cleaned the shroud. It's even harder to see now. But the remarkable thing about all this is it's as if we had a photo negative of our Savior. And then lo and behold, in about 1896, Segundo Pia in Italy was allowed to shoot a photograph. And he was a very small guy, and this was a huge camera, and he goes to shoot this photo. He focuses in on the face, he shoots it, and back then, of course, you don't have the local shop to develop your film, and you sure don't have digital photos. So he develops it in his black, and that's what he was looking at. You imagine that? It was about this big. It was a large print, but now he sees this. Now, parts here, like where you see these reverse L's, reverse L or like a 7, reverse 7, depending on how you look at it, there's more watermarks. Again, it's survived 2 fires, so they've had to spray, keep it from burning up. And it's pretty fascinating to look at all of the things that, without a doubt, check all the boxes in the New Testament. Let's go to the next slide. So, Isaiah 56. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Well, you can imagine how disappointing this was to Judas and all the other zealots, right? This guy's going to come in and he's going to get even. He's going to lay some waste to these Romans. And that's not at all what happened. He rides in on a donkey. They were hoping for a stallion. It's time to kick some butt. No. Next. Now, I'm going to let you handle this, Kirsten. we were saying, I said, every time I've done this talk, I usually get stuck pretty good with this. And I will leave this up here so when you get a chance to walk by, but this, what you're looking at up here, is believed to be the plant was probably what was done to create the, quote, crown of thorns, and very brutal, and even if you just touch it, it can draw blood. But what we believe is they probably didn't take time to make a real nice creative crown, because they would have. And I've seen a few pictures, a few paintings in other countries, not so much. I've seen in one book in this country where you imagine they might gather it together with cloth, or they've got a glove on or something, and then they just crush it down on his head. And that's what we believe by looking at the blood on the back of the head, and there on the front of the face, you see that 3. This is what starts. Barry said, I'm getting in there, I'm focusing my camera, we're doing these studies, and he goes, this isn't paint, it's blood. And it's surrounded by serum. That's what's fascinating. Next example is when you start looking closely here and on the shroud, you see a little more of the halo of the serum. And again, remember, Barry is a Jewish medical illustrator who shoots the photography for the forensic cases. Not at all what we expected. Next. Probably something more like that. Okay, looking at the blood on the back of the face. Something more like that. Next. And there's the petibulum. Notice in this one, it says 75 to 125 pounds. So again, the type of wood, the length of the petibulum would make a difference, of course. And the sedile, S-E-D-I-L-E, where sometimes you see that. Some images, you do see that, where, perhaps, and again, this has, what do you want to do? How long do you want them to last? How long do you want to torture them? You might give them a little rest like this, and then there was always a titulus, T-I-T-U-L-U-S, the title board that goes over, and anybody remember what did he put on it? Yeah, the king of the Jews, right? Yeah, one more jab back at him. And what's fascinating, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there is a piece of board that for years has been claimed to be half of this. And the more recent studies on that appear to be consistent. And it was written in the way, and it does include all 3 languages. The Greek, the Aramaic, and Latin. So this might be what it looked like, carrying the petibulum. And by locking that in place, we estimate that's probably only about 6 to 8 feet in height. So it's very personal to the family and the loved ones. Next. Now that one looks more like a railroad spike we were talking about. There is a guy in northern India, biblical artifact. He creates them for demonstrations, and his are built. I think this is more consistent, and I'll show you why in a moment. It was found in the 60s. You've heard of all of this about crucifixion. But where's the archaeological digs to support it? This is probably what you had. The reason this makes sense, again, the Romans recycled. They drive the nails in, torture you, kill you, but they take those nails out, they reuse them. It wasn't as easy as going to a store, right? Exactly. Mel can tell. Do we have the other blacksmith in here? Where's he at? There's another blacksmith. Yeah, these aren't easy. Yeah, you got to reuse them. The one that they do have, I'm kind of jumping to him. I'm going to get to the next slide to show you. But this one here, think about this. Have any of you ever had carpal tunnel? So you know it. And how many of you have, I know we've all hit our funny bone, right? And it isn't funny. It sends shock waves. If you put a nail right here, and again, I remind you, the Romans were very good at this. They're not going to bleed to death, but it sure is going to hurt because that's right up against, if not through, your median nerve. So, next. And this is what we started talking about too was, well, now did they actually put the nail in the palm? We think it had to go through the wrist. Okay? But if you do this, if you just take your finger to your thumb and you make this crease, you can, certainly with the length of those nails, you can put the nail here and drive it towards the wrist. You want to get into the wrist bones. This is what this x-ray is showing. There was one doctor who did quite a bit of research on this. Unfortunately, he developed dementia and has passed away, but Zugaby, if you ever look up, he's done some incredible research on this, but it goes through the wrist bones. What he discovered by taking cadavers, that if he hung people where it was just driven into the palm and you did not drive it through the wrist bones, it would tear out through the finger, so it cannot support the weight. But again, I think it was common that they not only nailed the individual, but probably tied him to the cross. But this is what we believe from archaeological finds and just the anatomy, what would support the body weight. Next slide. So here, I want you to take a close look at this. And again, the dimensions of the nail that we have there, this does match with that in terms of about 1 centimeter for the head of the nail. But notice if we do a cross-section, if we're looking through the cross-section here, you actually put that down, it goes right up against the median nerve, but it avoids the radial artery and the ulnar blood flow. You know what's great about that? You're not speeding up death. This is how the Romans thought. We can't conceive of this, but Jesus certainly did. He experienced it. Next. Psalms 22, 17 to 18. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. Doesn't sound like God, does it? Again, the Messiah, everyone was expecting someone powerful to come in and lay waste to the occupiers. Next. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. Again, interesting thing about this was scriptural reading and scriptural writings and ancient writings talk about the importance that his bones were not broken, but certainly you're hanging there, things are getting stretched out, you're getting probably some dislocations. But the reason that's important is because there's also something that happens taking too long to die. Because there comes a point, okay, torture, we need the cross for somebody else. I mean, again, Jesus was just another one, with the exception of Cornelius. He came to the realization, no, he's not just another one, right? Next. So, 1968, the archaeological discovery of the crucifixion. This guy was, we believe, early 20s, 22, 23, maybe not even that old. And it comes from 7 AD, so this is pretty close to the time of Jesus. Next. And you see the piece over. What that showed us was this. The nail was driven through the lateral aspect of the calcaneus. And they did, in fact, take a small block of wood and drove it through here into the lateral side of the stipes. I think, well, this is another thing that we have to think about was how was Jesus suspended from the cross? Now, notice the nail is still in the calcaneus. And again, interesting thing is, we think it probably hit a knot in the box. We know that Jewish burial. In fact, you can check that out if you want to pass that around. But Jewish burial, there's a period of time where you're lying in the tomb, and then eventually your bones are put in the ossuary. So this was found in a Jewish ossuary from that time period, with the nail still in it. So this kind of gives us more credence to the fact of what
that it was a type of nail that wasn't a big spike, because it's not going to get bent by the knot in the wood. Now, here's what's fascinating, and you'll get a chance to come by and take a closer look, but when we looked at the blood on the feet, the underneath of the feet, it even gives you an idea of which foot was on top of the other, and it's fascinating. But I remember we debated this. What do you think? Were the nails put, was it one nail or a 4-nail crucifixion? Because they could put it in both calcaneus, or they could put both feet, drive in, or you put one foot over the other. And most of our iconography that we see is Jesus having one foot over the other, right? Let's go to the next slide. And now here's another interesting calcaneus that's been found in Jewish burial. Well, actually, I shouldn't say Jewish burials, but archaeological digs in the Holy Land. What do you notice about this one? Yeah, it's pretty obvious. It's got a big hole, doesn't it? And the important thing is this. You always, I love documentaries, and they always love to point out. And there's no repair, so this individual is dead, right? So you don't see any repair within the hole. They've removed the nail to use on someone else, and that's what you have. Next. So this was a painting that Dr. Bergeron and I found that was a Russian artist, and we thought, maybe it looked like this. Yeah, could be. Next. Now, Jesus' bones were not broken, yet he died in only 6 hours. They brutalized Jesus before he ever went there. Dehydrated, bloodied, even before he was whipped, and eventually he ends up on the cross. If they wanted to rush your death and you're hanging from the cross, now I cannot explain to you, somebody who has carpal tunnel might be able to tell you, or imagine your funny bones ringing out from here all the way down your arms for however long you're up there, and you're struggling to breathe, and you need to push, you're trying to pull in some air. And I told people, I said about, this is dirty. There is feces, there's urine, there's blood, there's flies. You're hanging and you're pushing up, you're trying to breathe. And if you pull up, that just sends that lightning pain down your arms. At some point, the exactor mortis may say, break his legs. This is the Crucifixion. So references where you break both legs, now they're hanging. To breathe, you are really struggling to pull up and certainly to push up. So you can see, even when I talk about, was there a little stand? Maybe there was a little stand. The point is, though, what you need to really think about is how much Jesus loved you and went through for each and every one of you. This is the worst. And also, not only is it painful, but this is what happened. This is what's supposed to happen to criminals. Next. This is where it got interesting for us as we did more and more research. Because we know the statement is made that the lance is pierced into Jesus' side. Now, do you remember? Yeah, now here's what's interesting. If you look at this, it's the left side. You know why? I said, what would you have to be? 40 years or older to really get this, maybe. Because, if you did, you all have cameras in your phones now. But in the past, you shot a picture and there was a negative, and then this is the remarkable thing about this. This is the big, I said sometimes I feel like I'm always paying attention to the coincidences. When God winks, sometimes I feel like he's batting his eyes. I'm trying to keep up. Jesus' body is taken down, and you're getting to see some things that most people don't get to see. Barry became a good friend of ours, and so he allowed to have a
high resolution photo of the Sudarium of Oviedo. And then this, of course, is Barry's work here. This is Barry's work here. And in fact, if you ever want to go to Stera, that's a great website, Stera. It's the website all about this. So we are told that there were 2 piles of cloth, right? When they actually went into the tomb, they were lying separate. There was a face cloth, and there was the shroud. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Another coincidence, just how the Jews happened to bury people back then. Anyway, when they take them off the cross, they cover their face with the Sudarium. The movies all the time, right? I always find that interesting, if somehow you just pass your hand over and they close their eyes. It doesn't really work that way. But, you know, typically people do cover the face with something. And then, as Jesus is taken off the cross, he is then laying upon a shroud. The shroud has to be of only one type of material. And this one, which again, this is a high-resolution photo of it, has to be, this isn't going to surprise you much, 1 cubit by 4 cubits, 3 feet by 14 feet, and that's exactly what we have here. Now, over the years, they would hold it, royal family would hold it, people would come in, you know, they would have pilgrimages to come see it, and it started to get some fraying and stuff, so the people did some repairs along the edges. But the fascinating thing about this is, if you imagine the body laying this way, then they would come to they've removed the face cloth, and then they pull one end of the shroud to the other, and so it's like a billfold, okay? Then they wrap, and it's put in the tomb, the body's put in the tomb. Important thing about that is, if they did any other kind of burial, we wouldn't have such a great, but I said, you know, Jesus said, here, I'll leave you a photo. Here I am. Here's what I've done for you. This is, you get to see the detail here, but again, what's fascinating, Barry, just like every other photographer, whoever shot photos of this, went from an image that's kind of hard to see. You can see it, but you went from essentially a photo negative to the positive. And so, as you correctly said, it's in the right. Here's the blood. We said, well, that looks more like it's in the wrist. And guess what? The thumbs are not visible. Well, that's not surprising. You've driven nails right into the median nerve. That's what Barry kept saying. He goes, first of all, there's no pigment. It's blood and serum. And the detail of there's no way any artist would have known all these anatomical things that would happen if there's blood flow under the back, okay? But back to the stab wound. Again, this is probably a good representation height-wise, because that's about maybe no higher than this. So you imagine the centurion putting the sword into the right chest. And then we know Scripture says water and then blood flowed out. Right? Well, again, it's definitely, somebody was standing there giving you this eyewitness account. Of course, now we debate, how good are eyewitness accounts? Well, here's why I put this up. Have any of you had a CT scan yet? Yeah. What we do, we put you on that thing, slide you in there, start doing cross-section shots. That's what this is. This is a cross-section of a chest. That's the heart. The big circle right there is the aorta. Aorta, vertebra, and guess what that is? That's actually pleural fluid that collects under the lung. We see that in people who've been traumatized. The dark areas are the lungs, and then that's pleural fluid. That's when you're lying down getting a CT scan. Well, Jesus is upright on the cross. When the spear goes into his chest, the pleural fluid would be the first to come out, followed by the blood from the heart. Next. And we believe probably right into the right atrium, right near the right ventricle, and again, the fluid that would have collected below the right lung. Next. And again, Isaiah, he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Next. So, this is why we believe. There's a lot of debate. You've heard there's all kinds of craziness out there in terms of people trying to describe what happened to Jesus. And in fact, my friends who are Jewish, I always love having this conversation because you've got the most difficult explanation to come up with, really, right? Because, his body was stolen from the grave. Well, doesn't appear that way. And shock. This is one of the things, like Joe likes to say, shock, like you're jumping. Shock is where you've lost so much blood flow or so much of your blood vessels have dilated so much that you're not pushing blood out to all the major organs. So what happens is the oxygen supply and demand gets very low, and ultimately it starts your heart doing some crazy stuff. It doesn't beat normally, and now you're to the heart, the lungs, those sorts of things. And as you can see here, we talk about there's a hemorrhagic shock, there's a hypovolemic shock, traumatic hemorrhagic shock, and traumatic hypovolemic. Look, Jesus got hit with all of this. This is very traumatic. He's hemorrhaged some. He's certainly lost volume. He's dehydrated. He's lost blood. He's trying, the heart cannot send, there's not enough blood, nor is the heart functioning well enough to send blood to all of these areas. Next. So, as I just mentioned, what are those clues that we had about volume loss? The sweating of blood, the sweating, period. Blood loss from the crown of thorns, pleural effusion, which I mentioned to you. Again, that's just a collection of fluid that we see in anybody that we bring in. And what's amazing is this is stuff we've only found out since CT scans in the 80s. We know this now. We know it before we stick a chest tube in them, thankfully. Fluid deprivation. He was weak and fainting, walking to the execution. As I was saying, that's only 500 meters, about less than 5 football fields. And he cries out in thirst in John 19:28-30. I had the great blessing of working with Mother Teresa in 1997, and she said she had all these incredible paintings, and it just said, I thirst. I thirst. And one of the things she said was, he thirsts for your love. Jesus thirsts for you, for your soul. And it was ironic, I was speaking at Logansport Juvenile Intake Center, and one of the young men actually asked that question. He goes, do you think there was something much more deeper or spiritual about his comment that he thirsted? I said, that's a great question. Mother's whole ministry was based on that. Next. And then we started, this was interesting, Science Mag, Bergeron's research, and they called it the, instead of the Holy Trinity, it was the Unholy Trinity. Acidosis, hypothermia, coagulopathy. In other words, as you are not perfusing, your tissues start to die, your blood becomes more acidic, your temperature drops. We even know the temperatures that were consistent in that time, considering where Israel is located. And it, interestingly enough, it does interfere with your clotting cascade. Plunged into his side, the pleural effusion comes out, and you do bleed. So a lot of people debated that. Oh, he was dead. He wouldn't have bled. No. We know now, because of all of our trauma research over the last 30 years, these people do die, they do bleed beyond death because of how it affects the chemical reactions. Next. Cause of death, cardiac and respiratory arrest due to hypovolemic and traumatic shock due to crucifixion. There's Zugibe, if you ever want to check him. He's written some great books too, Zugibe. Next. It's painful to look at. Next. And of course, in Matthew 26:28, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Next. And this is the one I love to end with. When I got researching this more, this took on a whole new meaning to me. You've all read this before, I assume. But let's just go down to verse 5. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him, went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. Now, my question has always been this. What else would they have expected but suddenly you see this? You see the image of Jesus crucified, but the body is not there? That last sentence suddenly took on a whole new meaning for me. And what's interesting, along those lines, the Sudarium of Oviedo, it's in Oviedo, Spain. The Shroud of Turin is in Turin, Italy, separated by hundreds only about 20, 25 years ago with Barry's help. Barry describes himself as a long-haired hippie Jew. Mel and I went and picked him up at the airport once, drove up in an SUV and just held out a sign that said long-haired hippie Jew. And he loved it so much, he said, I got to keep that one. But they put the cloth around his face, Barry's face, and again, only about 25 years ago did they ever put these two together to look at the face cloth that supposedly is the face cloth of Jesus in Oviedo, Spain, and the burial cloth of Jesus in Torino or Turin, Italy. And guess what? The wounds matched. Another coincidence. The thing that, when I was grabbing all this stuff to bring to you, Daryl and I we're talking, this is one of my favorite pictures of Jesus. He definitely gets the last laugh on this, right? And my dad used to wear a tie clip that had laughing Jesus on it, and or Jesus laughing and I just always loved that picture. I had it hanging in my office at the hospital for years. And as difficult as it is to know Jesus went through all of this, it's also wonderful to know that he survived it, and he waits for us. I have had a great career of taking care of children, and in fact, Joe and I have been discussing going to let's start doing like a day-long seminar where Barry usually talks about 3 hours on the authenticity. By the way, the carbon dating was all flawed. They knew it, but they don't want you to know that it was flawed. Okay, they took out an area that had been repaired, had new cloth in it, and ironically enough, some people who thought this was the real deal said, something's wrong. And so they even accurately predicted the 3 carbon dating laboratories. They said, well, this one was from here, this one's from here, and this one's from here, probably. And guess what? They were right, because it's exactly where. And then Barry has always been aggravated by the fact that the English professor over in Britain, was it Cambridge, I think, or I can't remember. I think Cambridge, where they did one of that he was awarded with £1 million for proving this a fake, and they made it like this big headline, and I'm like, like you see so often in the media now, there's nothing. They haven't come back to correct that, but we are certain of this. This is authentic. This is what it is, and the part of it that what I think is important, you think of the Alpha, the Omega. Here's what I want to tell you today, too, is I've taken care of many children. I did pediatric hospice for 7 years. And I think I have some books in the car. If you'd like to have them, you're welcome to have those, because I always said I'm not the story, but I'm trying to be a good storyteller. But I've had children who have died and met Jesus. And Jacob Lewis, just, one of my great little heroes, his mom and dad were planning his funeral. They're going to donate his organs, and he opened his eyes. And then he found out we had a little chapel in the hospital. He goes, I need to go there. And they roll him down there. He's got about 40-some staples in his head, feeding tube in his nose. And he slumped. Mom, sister, dad, the kids get antsy in church. She said, we got antsy. Finally, Brittany, the 10-year-old sister, says, Jacob, trying to wake him up. Instead, the 9-year-old, still slumped over in his chair, said, shh. I'm asking God into my heart. And then he went on to tell us about stepping over, meeting Jesus. Jesus hugged him and said, it's not time. And he came, a remarkable young man who did pass away at age 27, but he also told his mom, you need to know I will be going again, but this time the door will close. You cannot follow me, but I'll see you later. And so I always tell people, I've been very blessed, because the thing I feared the most, death, horrible death, suffering, what the kids have taught me was this: I've gone from faith to fact. I will see all those children again. So, thank you very much.